Very much for being on the show today, Mr. Sharma. Now, the UK has reported the highest daily death toll of any European country, 980 people on Friday. Yesterday, the figure was 917. This is just the people dying in hospital as well. Why are people dying at a faster rate in the UK than in any other country in Europe?
Well, Sophie, right from the start of this whole situation, we've always been very clear that we will follow the scientific and medical advice that is put to us by our advisors, and we have taken the right steps at the right time in moving forward. We've also put forward a very clear plan in terms of how we address issues in relation to testing, in relation to getting more PPE into the system, and we will continue to work night and day to make sure that happens. From my perspective as Business Secretary, of course, we're also doing everything we can to support businesses, to support jobs, to make sure we support people's livelihoods, and that's absolutely right and proper. And if you look at the full range of what we put in place for businesses, it is pretty unprecedented, even by international standards.
I'm keen to talk about some of that support for business later in the interview, but I just want to pick up on you saying that we took the right steps at the right time, because some people will be looking at those death numbers and wondering if that's true. On the 3rd of March, the Prime Minister visited a hospital treating coronavirus patients where he said that he'd shook hands with people. On the 13th of March, tens of thousands of people went to the Cheltenham Horse Racing Festival. Now, by this time, the daily death toll in Italy was 200. We could see what was happening. We could see it was rising. So why didn't we take action sooner?
Well, as I said, look, we have followed, Sophie, the scientific and medical advice, and we will continue to do that. There is a debate at the moment, I know, that's taking place around when the current measures that we put in place for people to stay at home will come to an end. And we've been very clear on this, is that we are led by the scientific advice. The scientific advisory group, which advises the government, is meeting next week, and they will look at the evidence that's in place. And of course, we need to wait until we are past the peak. And as the Chief Medical Officer has said, we don't know when that will be. So we're going to be led all the way throughout this process by the medical advice, the health advice that we're getting. And I think that's right and appropriate. And I think your viewers watching this will agree with that.
You say you've always been led by the scientific advice, but did the scientific advice get it wrong at the beginning? Because on the 13th of March, the day that 70,000 people went to the Cheltenham Festival, Sir Patrick Vallance, the government's chief scientific advisor, said in an interview, our aim is to try and reduce the peak, not suppress it completely, because the vast majority of people get a mild illness to build up some kind of herd immunity. So will you admit that the original strategy changed, and as a result, lives may have been lost?
Well, look, I am extremely sorry for the loss of any life that's taken place through this global pandemic. And of course, that's right. And my thoughts are very much with the families and loved ones of all those who've lost their lives. The key thing now is to make sure that people follow the guidance, they stay at home, we protect the NHS, and ultimately this is about saving lives. So we are following the scientific and health advice that we're getting. And I think
did that advice change?
Well, as the situation has evolved, obviously, we have looked to see what the advice is, and we have acted on it. I am not.
So did that advice change?
Sophie, I am not a medical or scientific expert in these areas, and that is why we have advisors to give us that advice. That is why we have SAGE, and that is why we follow what it is that they are telling us to do.
I accept that you say that you're following the advice from the experts, but did that advice change?
Well, clearly, what we have seen is that in the past few weeks, we have asked people to observe the guidelines, to stay at home, except for a number of exceptions, and that is about saving lives, and it's also about making sure that we flatten the peak. We can have a discussion around the timeline on all of this, but I think the reality right now, what people want to see is that the government is acting on the medical advice. We want to make sure that people are following the guidelines, that they're staying at home, except for those exceptions. And this is ultimately about protecting lives. That is what the government is trying to do. And at the same time, as I mentioned at the start of this discussion, we're putting in place and have put in place an unprecedented economic package to support our businesses and support jobs and livelihoods in our country, so that when we come out the other side, which we will, businesses are ready to bounce back.
I'm just trying to work out that if we took the right steps at the right time, why are we posting a higher daily death toll than any other European country?
Well, different countries have different cycles in terms of where they are in terms of the spread of this pandemic. And what is appropriate right now is that people follow the advice and the guidelines that have been set out. And I think particularly we've got another 2 days to run of this bank holiday weekend. The weather is very nice, but actually we need to make sure that people observe the guidelines. And I'm very pleased to say the vast majority of the public is indeed doing that, and they are staying at home, except for those a few exceptions that we've set out.
Okay, I'm keen to ask you about protective equipment for the NHS, because today the Royal College of Nursing has issued guidance to say that nurses are within their rights to refuse to treat patients with coronavirus if they're not given adequate personal protective equipment. Is that right?
Well, it's absolutely right that no medical professional should be placed in a position where they have to make that choice. That is, for me, that's sort of self-evident. That is why we are making sure that we get protective equipment to the front line. And, you would have seen the plan that's been put out in terms of making sure that there is very clear guidance into what sort of protective equipment people need in particular settings. We've made sure that there is a huge distribution network that's now been set up. So over 700 million pieces of protective equipment have been distributed over the last few weeks. And we've also made sure that we are sourcing additional supplies as well as manufacturing supply in the UK. But we need to put this in the context of where we are. In a normal circumstance, Sophie, you would have us providing PPE to about 233 hospital trusts across the country. We're now talking about supplying 58,000 NHS and social care settings. I mean, that is a huge increase. And on top of that, of course, there is huge global demand for PPE, and that does put a squeeze on supply. But what I'm really pleased about is that we've got British companies coming forward, changing from what they're normally doing to manufacturing PPE. You've got Burberry's, which are making gowns. You've got companies like Ineos and Brewdog, which are making sanitizers, hand sanitizers. And you're also seeing people like McLaren and Rolls-Royce who are making visors. And I think people have stepped up to really support this. And this is a unified effort in making sure that we get more PPE out there to the front line.
Clearly, there is a huge demand on personal protective equipment in the middle of a pandemic. No one would dispute that. The question is, would our nurses right to refuse to treat patients if they don't feel they've been given the right protective equipment to keep them safe?
Look, they shouldn't be placed in that position, and that is, of course, it is the job of government to make sure that they are not finding themselves in that position, and that is why we have a programme of making sure that distribution is taking place across the country. As you will have heard, we are setting up a portal over the next couple of weeks, so healthcare settings can actually directly input what they require, and we can see in real time what the demand is and then make sure that we get the supply out there. There's a 24/7 hotline for people in an NHS or social care setting to call so that they can get access to PPE. But of course, they should not be placed in that position. And I completely accept that it is up to the government to make sure that we fix this.
If you accept that, I wonder if you'll take this opportunity to apologise for the shortages that we've seen. Yesterday, Priti Patel said, "I'm sorry if people feel there have been failings." I mean, it sounds a bit like the kind of apology you give if you don't really want to say sorry. So will you say sorry to healthcare workers?
Well, I think at the start of this programme, I said I was sorry for the loss of any life through this pandemic. But, we are facing an
But that's a bit different. Will you
situation.
apologise to healthcare workers who feel that they don't have the right protective equipment to do their jobs?
Well, as I said, it is our job to make sure that we get that healthcare equipment, that PPE out to them. Right now, that is what your viewers will be asking, is that, what is the government doing? Does the government have a plan to get this PPE out to the front line? And the answer is yes, we do have a plan. We are putting that in place. We're making sure that there are hundreds of millions of PPE kit equipment, which is going out to the front line. And of course, we need to be doing even more. And that is why we have this plan of making sure we have additional supply, which we're sourcing, but then also doing home manufacturing in the UK.
OK, now you are, of course, the Business Secretary, and you were speaking a bit earlier in the interview about some of the support that the government is offering to the economy at this clearly very difficult time. You put in place a scheme to help small and medium-sized businesses, the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme. So as of today, how many loans have been granted under this scheme?
Well, the latest figures that I have is around 4,200 and just over 800 million pounds has gone out. What I would say to you is that this has been set up at speed, and we've made additional changes over the last few days, which have been announced, which means that actually all small and medium-sized businesses up to a turnover of 45 million pounds can now access this scheme. I've spent the last couple of days talking directly to some of the largest lenders who are part of this scheme. And I've been very clear to say to them that we need to get money out of the door as quickly as possible. They understand that, and banks know that on this occasion they have to be part of the solution, and they want to be part of the solution. You've had the organisations I've talked to have had people working and continuing to work over this bank holiday weekend, so they can talk to their customers, they can provide that support. And I hope what you will see in the coming days is an increase in money flowing out. It is vital that we do everything we can to support our businesses and, of course, protect jobs. And that is why, if I sort of mention a couple of the other schemes as well, Sophie, the job retention scheme, again, is to make sure that people can stay in a company so that when we actually have an upturn, when we come out of this, which we will, then we are able to go forward in businesses and quickly restart and take advantage of that start.
So at the beginning of the answer, you said around 4,200 loans have been granted. Now, there's been reportedly around 300,000 applications. That's just 1.4% being granted. I mean, this is really concerning, isn't it? I mean, some of these businesses are they going to collapse, aren't they?
Well, so I think, look, the first thing I'd say to you is that we have set this up at pace, and everyone is literally working around the clock. I can tell you, as someone who's been involved in the setting up of this scheme.
You must be worried, though.
Well, of course. I mean, it's not just a question of me being worried. I completely understand the concerns that businesses have. However, there is additional support that we're also providing. So we have made sure that there are grants available for small and medium-sized businesses, those in specific sectors, and £12.3 million has already gone out to local authorities which are administering that particular scheme. And of that, as of the 5th of April, £1.2 billion had gone out, supporting almost 100,000 businesses. So we are very keen to make sure this money flows out as quickly as possible. But I'm sure people also understand that all of these schemes have been set up at pace. People have literally worked around the clock and continue to work around the clock. And let me give that assurance to any businesses that are watching this, that as Business Secretary, I'm totally committed to making sure that money goes out of the door as quickly as possible from our schemes, but also from the banks. And I will continue to have those daily conversations.
We've spoken a bit about the economic consequences of the lockdown. And of course, there are some really serious consequences of the lockdown as well. There's been reports of people going hungry, not getting the food that they need. Priti Patel yesterday spoke about calls about domestic violence increasing at an alarming rate. People are losing their jobs. There's been damage to mental health, of course, as well. Does there come a tipping point when the negative consequences of the lockdown start to outweigh its need, of course, to keep the virus at bay?
Well, Sophie, can I just sort of make this point, which is that all of us in government are completely united on the fact that we need to follow the scientific and medical advice that we have. We will follow the advice that SAGE gives us. What we need to do first and foremost is to make sure that we are saving lives of people across our country. That is absolutely vital. But of course, as you say, this pandemic has had a big negative impact on the economy, not just in the UK, but indeed across the world. This is a global issue, but that is why we have put in place the unprecedented set of schemes that we have to support businesses and to make sure people are not losing their jobs, they can be furloughed, and so that when we come out the other side, businesses are able to restart quickly.
The government's going to be making a decision later on this week about whether or not to extend the lockdown. It looks almost inevitable that it will be extended. There's been speculation in the newspapers this morning and throughout the last couple of days that it could be until May when we start seeing those restrictions being eased. Is that about right?
Well, I'm not going to enter into a discussion, and you'll forgive me for that, Sophie, because I think what's important here is that we let SAGE do their work, to look at the evidence, and then to come and tell us in government, what direction we should be going with this.
Could it be tightened then, if you're looking at the direction we should be going? Could the lockdown be tightened further?
Well, again, I'm not going to sort of speculate on any of this. I don't think that's actually particularly helpful at this stage. What is important is the clarity of the message, which is that right now people should observe the guidelines, they should stay home, they should protect the NHS, and this is ultimately about saving lives. And if there is further evidence that comes forward from SAGE, we will of course consider that. But up until that point, the guidelines will stay in place.
OK, and just finally, do you have any update on the health of the Prime Minister?
Well, I mean, I'm really pleased that, of course, he is out of ICU. I understand that he is in very good spirits. He's walking about a bit. But what is really important, I think, is that he has the rest. We all wish him the very best, and we want him to get back, fully fit. And I think for me, actually, what's been really pleasing throughout this process, of course, we've all been incredibly worried about the Prime Minister, but what's been very pleasing is that colleagues across the political spectrum have joined together to wish the Prime Minister well. And I think that does show that there is a unity, there's a unity of purpose across our country, and I hope that will continue.
OK, thank you very much for being on the programme today. Amok Sharma there, Business Secretary.